Please help me welcome to the stage my good friend, Lee Moe.
Can we go back? This is the moment. Tonight is the night. We'll fight till it's over. So we put our hands up like the ceiling can't hold us. Like the ceiling can't hold us.
So first I'll start off by thanking Brian for that introduction. And I feel it's very interesting to me from my former Marine Corps career that I started out mitigating manned aircraft systems as a F-4 and F-18 pilot to now I'm moderating a panel on mitigating unmanned systems. It's only, I think, where technology has led us. And we're very fortunate today with this panel. We have Michael Huerta, Andrew Velasquez, and Matt Cornelis. And I think we'll get right into it. And we'll start out with, Michael, why don't you lead us off with the big picture on what's going on with unmanned systems and how the federal government is looking at mitigation of them.
Well, thanks, Lee, and it's great to be here. I think it's probably fair to say when it comes to securing critical facilities such as airports that it's complicated. There is a multi-layered jurisdictional set of questions that need to be addressed. There are authorities and responsibilities that exist at the federal level, state and local governments. Some airports are set up as special districts. And it requires a very tight relationship with local law enforcement. There are also authorities and legal issues that need to be resolved. And then, of course, let's not lose sight of technology. There are many that are out there thinking about we need the perfect technological solution that will enable us to secure critical infrastructure. And I think that what we've all seen is that while there are many solutions out there, there are few that really offer a comprehensive silver bullet that would secure critical infrastructure such as airports. And this is important to get right and to resolve because airports are incredibly important economic drivers to our country. You know, on any given day, we have 50,000 flights that take place in our national airspace system. They are a tremendous economic engine, and so any level of disruption of that is something that has ripple effects throughout the entire economy. And so what we need to do is ensure that they don't happen, and if something does happen, that there are appropriate mitigations in place so that the system can return to normal operations. So what's that going to take? Well, what it's going to take is, first of all, a clear understanding of what technologies are out there today and what are technologies that would be available in the future that could enable us to conduct the appropriate levels of surveillance of what's happening over our airports, that can provide tools to airport management and to first responders about what's going on in the vicinity. But technology isn't everything. There also have to be operating practices. If an incident presents itself, how can responders determine whether it represents a threat? Is this an unmanned aircraft that is authorized to be in the vicinity? And is it conducting, appropriate and necessary services on behalf of the airport? And then who needs to be involved in that response? There's air traffic control, there's airport management, there's local law enforcement. And this is a new and evolving area, and all of those protocols and relationships need to be defined and they need to be rehearsed, because I think that what we've all seen as a result of the last few months, starting at Gatwick Airport in London, these incidents, we have to expect that they're going to happen, And we need to have appropriate technologies and appropriate responses to enable us to ensure that they don't cause widespread disruption across the national airspace system.
Thanks, Michael. And Matt, from the airport's perspective, what are the major issues you see if we take it from the big picture down to the local level, every airport? How are the airports dealing with this?
Well, thanks, Lee. And I think Michael really hit on a couple key points. Our environments that airport operators deal with are complicated, to say the least. Thousands of employees, millions of passengers. The air system had over 800 million passengers last year. And so all these stakeholders have to come together to make sure that operations run smoothly day in and day out. Safety and security are the #1 priorities for any airport operator and anybody operating in the airport environment. And so they're really looking for guidance in a way to deal with these. Right now, there isn't really any federal guidance in terms of how these threats are dealt with. And there are technologies out there that can help give data to airports and to the stakeholders at airports, but there's not action once there's an identified threat or even identified vehicles in the area. So we're really looking to develop on a policy side some guidance in terms of who deals with threats when they happen, how does the airport respond, and then actually, as you said, Michael, really practice and prepare for when something does happen. Airports spend all of our time really looking at any possible situation and making sure that we're ready to respond. And this is just a new threat in the environment that we need to be ready for.
Thanks, Matt. Airports are very different. We have big, we have large, we have small, we have remote. Andrew, here in Chicago, not only deals with O'Hare, but he also has Midway, and he's also responsible for all the special events. So Andrew has a very difficult job at best. So how are you dealing with unmanned system mitigation for the city of Chicago?
Well, that's a good question, and both of my panelist colleagues brought up some really good points, and I think for us, it is a non-traditional, evolving threat that we continue to contend with. We do take great pride in ensuring that we are developing scenario-specific plans for all of the hazards that would be germane to the airport environment. But when it comes to dealing with UAS mitigation, it's such a complex threat. Trying to understand all the nuances on all the varieties of different types of threats and scenarios that come along with UAS is a challenge. It's like we don't know what we don't know. But nonetheless, we are going to be taking some steps to at least tabletop some of these potential scenarios that may take place, so that way we could better understand what we could potentially be facing, what are the vulnerabilities, what are the gaps, who's in charge. That question of command and control always seems to come up, right? Who's in charge if we have a drone incident, an incursion, whatever the case may be. And so, at the very least, sitting down with all of our critical partners that make up our multi-layered security strategy and really talking through some of these challenges. We have a great working relationship with our Intel partners at our fusion centers, and so getting them involved so that way we can better understand what the threats are with regard to UASs, and trying to figure out, okay, what are those scenarios and how would we work toward the mitigation of an event if it were to take place. One of the things that I see, primarily is there's a heavy emphasis, obviously, on prevention and mitigation, but an area that I tend to think that we're lacking in is on the recovery side of the house, if you will. And so, what happens if the event happens, whatever that UAS event may be, if it requires an evacuation, right? If it requires, assisting passengers to get rebooked, right? If you've got luggage all over the place, how are you recovering that? There are so many aspects to recovery business continuity, reconstitution. These are the things that we need to be thinking about as we start developing scenario-specific plans as it relates to UASs. And so understanding the threat, understanding the scenario and what the scenario might be, and then developing those specific plans to have an understanding. Again, you don't know what you don't know. Is it a weaponized, drone? Is it a drone that's just designed to disrupt operations? I mean, there's so many different scenarios, but the important thing is that you're taking a look at them, you're trying to understand them, the threats, and then developing whatever response plans and recovery plans you can develop to the best of your ability to at least try to address the threat is what we're working on.
Thanks, Andrew. And Michael, you've agreed to chair the Blue Ribbon Task Force that AUVSI and ACI has put together to address some of these issues. And after being an administrator of the FAA for several years, you know the complexities of dealing with legislative and regulatory treatments in Washington. Now, in private enterprise and the civilian world, advising on this, where do you see the airports and cities in the country, where do they need to go? What do they need to have the proper treatment to mitigate these threats?
Well, as I talked about before, I think that it needs to be a blend of things. And I think that one thing that seems to be going on right now, and this is what we got to get past, is large segments of the universe of people that need to be involved are waiting for someone else to come up with a solution. And it goes back to the point that Andrew made just a minute ago, who is in charge here? And so, and the reality is everyone has a piece of this. And so we're only going to figure it out if we bring those disparate interests together because everyone has a different perspective that is necessary. And this is not unusual in aviation. In aviation generally, we have a model that has served us very well of the industry coming together both among themselves and with their government partners to figure out incredibly complicated issues and challenges. And this one is no different. And so, first of all, bringing everyone to the table, which is what we envision at the Blue Ribbon Commission serving as a first step, to define the issues, define the problems, but also understand what are the things that we need to think about. What I think we're going to learn is that there are a lot of technologies that are out there that are helpful in tracking what's going on in the system. And this is important because aviation generally is premised upon a model of cooperative use of the national airspace. What do I mean by that? That means that people who are flying broadcast their position, they announce to the world where they are, and everyone operating in the system has a responsibility to see or sense and avoid others that are flying in that same airspace. And so the first thing that we have to establish is who are the cooperative users? And there is a lot of work to be done in that area. One important factor is identification systems for unmanned aircraft, which is something that is very much at the forefront of everyone's thinking right now. And so if you know who should be there, that makes it a whole lot easier to figure out who's not authorized to be there. And so, there's this technological and policy element that we need to sort through. Then you have the guys that aren't supposed to be there, and here's where airport operations, airport management, federal first responders, and law enforcement, everyone comes to the table to figure out, what do we do now? It is a pretty dramatic call to shut down an airport. And so I think it's important to qualify the types of incidents that might emerge and what kind of response does it call for. Everyone operating around airports cares about safety more than anything else, and no one's going to do anything that isn't safe, but at the same time, you want to avoid the overreaction. And it goes back to what we were talking about just a minute ago. You don't know what you don't know. And so what you need are the tools that help inform that knowledge so that you can gauge an appropriate response.
Thanks, Michael. And Matt, in a word, in order to achieve this, what are your members, what are airports saying they need now?
I mean, basically two things, a detection ability and then a mitigation technology. And right now we don't have the authorities to mitigate. There are a lot of complications with doing that, but the framework for getting to mitigation doesn't necessarily really exist at the moment. And that's where we were very concerned. Our members are very concerned about if and when something like this happens, what do we do? And I think Michael did a really nice job of kind of laying out the spectrum of threats. And for most of them, we talked earlier about careless and clueless operators, which are a problem but not necessarily a significant threat. But there's that one end of the spectrum that is the serious threat. And when you have that, you don't have time. And what we saw in Gatwick was it was a 2-day event, and it took a long time to get the appropriate governmental agencies aligned to respond. And so we want to make sure that our members and the traveling public are protected, and that airports and law enforcement, whoever the framework will be, can respond when that worst case scenario happens.
So Andrew, we were talking previously about Chicago and the benefit you have with the great Chicago police force that has jurisdiction at both airports, and that you have members of that force on both sides of security. In order to mitigate these threats, what is it that you need from a cooperative, a technical, regulatory, legislative? What would help you not only do the job better at the airport, also handle all the special events that you have here in Chicago?
Well, I think first and foremost, I think at the core of all of this is what I like to call the 3 C's, right? Communication, cooperation, and collaboration, right? So while we do have jurisdiction, Chicago Police, over both airports, at O'Hare we have contiguous suburban departments that we've entered into mutual aid agreements with, because there could quite possibly be an event that could be so overwhelming that would require maybe some support from our contiguous suburban departments. Instead of reaching into the communities within Chicago, if we have those mutual aid agreements, we have them close by, we can immediately activate those mutual aid networks and bring them into the airport environment if necessary. So I think having those relationships, and I heard the previous speaker talk about the importance of relationships, is so critical, because in order for us to effectively work toward addressing this type of threat, I think those relationships have to be in place. There's no question. I think what we need, really, from our perspective, a lot is guidance. We're lacking in guidance. And I think guidance is obviously important because it helps inform, many of our decision-making efforts. And so to the extent that we can get the necessary guidance that we need, also the authorities that will allow us to do what we can do or what we can't do, would be helpful guidance for us, because right now, as was mentioned earlier, we don't know what we don't know. So just trying to get that necessary guidance, the authorities in place, understanding a solid command and control structure could come out of that. And right now we're lacking in those areas. And so to the extent that we can get that type of information would be very beneficial to us.
Mm-hmm. So it's very timely that ACI and AUVSI has partnered together to start this Blue Ribbon Task Force to address the issues. All the lessons learned are not out yet on these events that occurred in Gatwick and other places. So now as we move forward, everyone partnering together, building on relationships, believing in building on the jurisdictional issues that we have, can only help us address if there's a future event. With that, Michael, do you have any other ideas that you'd like to share with the audience on mitigation?
Well, I think it is important to recognize that this is going to be an ever-evolving issue. And I think where the Blue Ribbon Panel's work will be extremely important is in creating a menu of what are the issues and challenges that need to be addressed, and what are the elements of what response, what technologies need to be, what needs to be included in that. But that, even when all that work is done, and even when all those standards are defined, that doesn't mean the problem's gone away. Because we live in a very dynamic world, and it's going to be constantly changing. And we all talk about how unmanned aircraft are a game-changing technology that is enabling so much good in our economy and our world, and with great things going on in the humanitarian area, making businesses more efficient, improving safety. Well, the same is true for some of the bad things that could potentially happen. The bad guys are also thinking about how they can evolve, how they can adapt. And so as we look at this issue, we need to be planning for not only the industry as we know it today, but we need to be thinking about where it will likely go in the future. And we need to build flexible and dynamic frameworks that enable us to adapt to not only the opportunity, but also to the threats.
Great. And Matt, last words from the airports.
Well, we're really excited about the partnership and the Blue Ribbon Task Force. This can't happen fast enough from our perspective, so we're glad to partner with AUVSI on this. One of the things, we represent actually airports in the US and Canada, and we're part of a global network of airport operator representation. So we are excited, and we think that the product that will come out of this group was really applicable not only across the border to the north, but around the world, because as Michael said, this is an evolving threat, and it's not just a US problem.
That's right.
And Andrew, dealing with it as an operator on the ground, dealing with it daily, any last thoughts?
I share Matt's same sentiments. I mean, just the looking forward to, the products that will result from the task force, I think would be very beneficial to, the end user, so to speak, in terms of, best practices, technology that has been vetted that could be beneficial to airports. I mean, my inbox gets inundated from technology companies that all say they have the premier, detection and mitigation drone technology, and so it's trying to get a handle on really what's out there. And so my hope is that this task force will be able to at least give us some direction and guidance relative to those technologies that are vetted, that are really beneficial, that could help us out. So looking forward to the products that will come out of the task force.
Great. So if the audience would thank the panelists, we're fortunate to have them today, and looking forward to the product of the Blue Ribbon Task Force. Thank you.